Yeah. Thank you so much, though. This is really it's I was surprised that you were so quickly able to do this. So I'm really happy. And
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. We're joined this hour, incredibly, by former poet laureate of the city of San Francisco, Devorah Major, who is going to share with us her story, some insights into her poetry and as well as her writing career in general. Um, Devorah, you were the third poet laureate of San Francisco. Can you tell us a little bit about your poet laureateship?
Yeah, it was a really nice experience. When you get to be the shortlisted, they ask you, what would you do if you were given this? And I kind of said, oh, I don't know, something, but it'll be good. Just, it was hard for me to commit myself without knowing, what kind of help I'll get, what it'll be. But I started something because I was seeing so many memorials on the street of young people uh, did for themselves, for each other, rather. And I lived in the time in a cooperative in San Francisco. And I went to ask or tell something to one of my board members. I was on the board then. And there was a memorial right across the street, and she dismissed it in what I thought were disparaging terms. And I thought, I think it's the fact is these young people are showing a certain reverence for each other and for life. It's not that they don't value life, it's that they don't know how to sustain it sometimes, to my mind. Anyway, so I created a project called War and Peace on the Streets, however you think of that. And within it, I had poets write on that theme whatever they thought about it every month. Not poets, people. And I divided it into categories. There were people who called themselves a poet. There were people who wrote poetry and didn't call themselves poets. There were children, which is not teenaged yet, teenagers, and it was a San Francisco poet laureate, and San Francisco residents. And then there were poems that I asked for on the theme or on the theme of San Francisco or the streets of San Francisco. And every month I got lots of submissions. I picked out the best ones. The San Francisco Public Library, who were incredibly generous through all of this, had a webmaster make a website for me so I could post them all. I got the San Francisco Chronicle. I wish I could remember who was the editor then, but he was very kind too, to not only commit to publishing a poem a month, but paying the poet for the poem, because if you pay your garbage man, and thank you, garbage men, they're so necessary, and you pay your plumber, and thank you, plumbers, you should pay your artist. So then I had a featured poet of the month, and that poet had their poem in the library newsletter with the picture of themselves if it was available, and a little interview, a bio I did. So I did that for a year, and at the end of that, uh, Nancy Peters, who had edited my poet laureate book of poetry, what Lawrence Ferlinghetti started was a series where each poet laureate got a book put out, which included their speech. We were required to make a speech on the state of poetry or the state of poetry in San Francisco, as well as a selection of poems. So we had just had a wonderful working relationship. She was just is still an incredible editor and had insights. And so she said, gee, I'd like to do another project. And I said, well, I've got all these poems now. It'd be really nice if we could have a book. And so we talked about it, and she said, okay. And we came up with an anthology called The Other Side of the Postcard. And again, I had people submit or tell me they wanted the poem they already had, whatever, and tried to have a good cross section of all the categories I had before: the teenagers, the children, the people who called themselves poets, the people who wrote poetry but didn't, and San Francisco residents. And the book came out, and the book's been selling ever since. It's been really a lovely, lovely achievement.
So for those who are unfamiliar with the role of Poet Laureate, they work primarily with the library system. And the San Francisco library system is legendary for being how known for how supportive and responsive they are to the community. Can you tell us a little bit about the San Francisco library system?
Well, I love the library and I love librarians. My father took me to the library. I learned how to read really, really early as a little girl and tried to get me a card. And because he was really good on reading books, but evidently not as good on returning them, they weren't going to get me the card at once, but he convinced them that he would make a deal, but they needed to give me a card. I needed to be in the library. So I went to the children's library. We lived in the Richmond district at the time. We had just moved out of North Beach a couple of years earlier. We were in the Richmond district. And they have a library that has a really nice separate children's room around the edge. Well, it didn't take me that long to read all the books I cared to read in that section of the library. I mean, say a year, but not that long. That was the other books I wasn't that interested. I mean, I know people who love Nancy Drew, wasn't my cup of tea. I just, everything's that. So I went to my dad and I said, what about the upstairs library? And he said, well, if you can understand the book, you can read it. So we went to the librarian again, and the librarian was like, no, she's a child. And their book she hasn't read. And he explained to her that I got to read what I wanted to read. Outside of school, you have to read what you have to read. But, and that if I didn't want to read any more books in the section, she should give me a release to go to the adults library. That's very good. I was very, very quiet child, well behaved. So she did, because you had to get a release from the children's library. And I went upstairs, and it was a world of wonder to me. And so I fell in love with San Francisco libraries. And as I moved into adulthood and then used different libraries, well, we moved, so then I had a different library. I began to really understand the libraries. I mean, the San Francisco library, like if you go to the Hunters Point Library, which of course is heavily African American, they have some incredible books that you might not see on the shelves of the other libraries having to do with African and African diaspora writers and history and things, and their own readings and events and displays. Every library does. There's the library that I believe is on, is the Presidio branches. Maybe it's on California Street. But they have the stuff for people who are seeing or hearing impaired. And so that, and you get to know, who has the heavily Chinese collection, who has the heavy Japanese collection, who has the, I mean, obviously the Mission Library has a lot of selections of Spanish language books, that kind of, that the library system, at least in San Francisco, is very responsible to its population. And so you might have to look a little bit, but you can look well. And when I did a play called Classic Black African Americans in 19th century San Francisco. And I had to do a lot of research because I was doing people, blacks that really were here, real people, not imagined people. And one of the places I went was to the library, which I've learned to go to. And when I needed something and got stuck, I could just go up to a library. And I think people don't understand all the time. They think, oh, you check books out at the library. Well, yes, but you also have access to computers for a period of time. And you also have access to just some wonderful music that you could sit right there with headphones on and listen to it, and, videos and so on and so forth. But I think the most valuable resource is the librarians, because you say, I'm trying to do a project on this, and I'm wondering where I could find that. And they go, well, you could look here, and you could go there. I really think you ought to go look at the microfiche here. And it was just so that when you're talking about the library system, of course, there's the buildings and the books and the book trucks and all of that, but the librarians are what make a library go. Yeah. And it's quite incredible.
Yeah, no, the library is an incredible public space that in many ways, it just doesn't seem like there's a disconnect between what's their actual function and the general community use of it. I mean, we really, it seems like there needs to be, or it seems like something has been lost somewhere along the way. Because I remember when I was a kid, I mean, how much the library meant to me, but maybe I was just a nerdy kid. I don't know. Maybe that was just
the way. I know I went to the library more than other kids, but we all went to the library some. And then we had school libraries, which many schools no longer have, and school librarians. And so I think it was a different relationship. But I know that um, my daughter, more than I did even, she had her kids at the little kid readings where they do the children's storytelling and little puppet shows, and it made them excited about books and libraries. And I think that's where you instill that interest. I mean, the San Francisco Library has a whole room that you can't even go in if you're not a teenager, where you can record your hip hop or this or that or the other thing. And I go by it and I see a few teenagers here and there, but I'm like, you guys don't understand what a resource this is. You can make your own recordings here, but I think I agree with you. Something has been lost that people don't understand. There's not much of the commons left in our country, but the libraries is a very vital part of the commons.
Absolutely. So you are the author, I believe, of four books. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. Four poetry collections.
Oh, I think it's more than that now.
Oh, okay. I'm just looking at your website. So you correct me with that.
Oh, yeah, my website. Yeah, I need to update it. I had
Oh,
a book which was just an incredible experience and blessing, published in Italy last year, a bilingual book called
okay.
With Open Arms, Abbraccia Aprete, something like that. Anyway, With Open Arms. And I have one coming out this year. And yeah, I think so. Maybe it's 4 books, 5, 6, I think it's 7. But anyway, that's close enough.
a number of poetry books. Is there any way? I
Yeah.
know I'm putting you on the spot, and we didn't cover this ahead of time. But is there any way you could share a poem with us now?
Sure. Yeah, I took some poems out. Okay, um,
For those just tuning in, this is Devorah Major, third poet laureate of San Francisco. Room for real treat. This is a real honor. The Doss Center for the Arts, part of our signature series. We're really, we're flabbergasted to have got you such short notice, and so we're very, very excited. And everyone
well,
else,
thank
everyone watching now should be very excited. We're about to hear a poem from Devorah Major.
Okay, I'm with, I guess, all the other poets in the world, many writing COVID poems.
Yeah.
So this is one of my COVID-19 poems, and this is COVID-19 and the unhoused. I wonder at those in doorways, under canvas tents, sheltered beneath cardboard cartons, inside dented, cramped cars, their dry coughs echoing into the night as they shiver inside their fevered flesh. What does pandemic mean to the homeless we have already socially distanced, easily averting our gaze, righteously avoiding getting close enough to put a dollar into a palm, a smile into shadowed eyes, not seeing, much less acknowledging that they have lived for years in a pandemic of poverty, a pandemic of hunger, a pandemic of danger, a pandemic of struggle with very limited reward. What now of this new virus pushed down their burning throats to rest inside their eternally broken hearts? What now?
What now, indeed. Wow, that was a very incredible poem. So San Francisco is a city of have-nots and have less and and billionaires, right? And a
And
handful of
have too much. Stupid rich.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in your
Yeah.
lifetime, how have you seen the city change from being, a city of rich and poor to now a city of just absurd
Well,
proportions?
I mean, I grew up, working class. I mean, I guess everybody who lives to paycheck is working class. So I don't know how, but working class family. I mean, it was a little different because my mother was a painter, my father was a writer, but they had straight jobs. So and all my friends and neighbors were that. I didn't really have a sense of the difference of economics as much until really I got to high school. I knew there were different communities, and I knew like we lived in when we lived in North Beach, that was the artsy fartsy community, but I was a little kid. We moved to the Richmond and we integrated the neighborhood. We actually got the flat because our landlords were black and they wanted somebody for their kids to play with. And there was us, and then there were the Filipinos that lived around the corner. And as far as I remember it, the rest of the city the school was pretty white. But then we moved when I was 11 to the Haight Ashbury. And at the time, I didn't know this till I was an adult, the Haight-Ashbury was 40% black. And our school, which the elementary school I went to there was Grattan, was black and white and Filipina and Latino and a little bit of Korean, as I remember. Probably some Chinese, but I don't remember. This is what I remember, so that means it's kind of who my friends were. And so I always thought of it then as a multicultural city, okay, on a certain level, because that was the mix I was in. And additionally to that, my parents were very, the conservative word would be radical. And so I was involved in a lot of the civil rights struggles because my father was. He had a good friend who made him like the head of education of NAACP. So I was like on the Board of Education picketing, and the consent decree that they operate under now is the one that was put in place when my father was doing that. And then I was on Van Ness because people looked up and said, you know, black people buy a lot of Cadillacs, but there are no black salesmen. And so they shut down Auto Row with the help of students from UC Berkeley, as a matter of fact, in SF State, and just up and down every auto shop on Van Ness. And a weekend later, they found black people to sell cars. And then they worked on firemen to get a black, you know, it was like this constant. So I had this sense of struggle as successful. You know, I didn't have a sense of struggle as useless or why do we do this, you know. And so by the time the Vietnam War came, of course, I was there. My mother had taken me to Women for Peace things at the very, very beginning. And so I was very invested in the idea of peace. And I was part of when they show it on the film, the march that went from Embarcadero all the way down. We went down Bell Street into the park. And then the Hells Angels was guarding the sound system. They always wanted to make it out that all the Hells Angels were right-wing racist. But it was divided. What they all were was rebels. And then within being a rebel, one has one's own consciousness, and some had more and some had less. But anyway, some of the ones with more came. And that was the one where there were helicopters flying overhead and some really fiery speeches by Panthers and a lot of other people. It was really, so that was my experience of San Francisco, a city of a lot of different cultures that came together and that created change.
Yeah. And so now today's San Francisco, how would you like
Well, now it's balkanized. Most of the black people are gone. I mean, if you think about it, I grew up with 14% black. That's 14 out of every 100. I mean, it's not a majority, but it's a nice little population. Now we've grown from under 4 to 4%, a little bit over 4%. So not having as much presence there of that. Certainly there's a larger Asian presence. I mean, partly because of America's war, so we've got the Vietnamese and the Cambodians and like that, but also the Chinese, who were primarily in Chinatown and some other places, are hugely in the Richmond and parts of the Sunset. You know, they've really moved out, as well as Koreans, so that they have neighborhoods instead of neighborhood, you know, but yet it's not all positive because it's very balkanized. And I would say probably the Mission is one of the most complex neighborhoods yet and still in terms of ethnicity, you know. But there's much less of that. And then the divisions are so large between the poor and the rich. And I would go into places, even in fact, I was walking with my friend down Haight Street. Now, I grew up in the Haight. When the hippies came, I was there at 15 years old, like, oh, wow, what's this? So it's like my street, it's my hood. You know, that's where I became 18. Then I moved and I spent most of my adult life in Fillmore. But before that, you know, the neighborhood I identified was the Haight. I'm in the Haight, and storekeepers are like ignoring me, and people are like, what are you doing here? And it's like, what are you doing here? When did you get here? I've been here.
Yeah.
You know, so it's very, very different. One store I remember going into with a good friend of mine who bought me a lovely piece of jewelry. And then we went back a couple of years later and they didn't even greet us. It was the same store. It's like, oh, we don't need your business anymore. That kind of a thing, that there's more, uh, uh, not not being seen, not being heard. I was taken out to breakfast some years ago by my not a whole lot, but they've been passed for a few years ago for a birthday, and we went to my mother's favorite restaurant. And when we got there, the guy asked, first of all, a white couple near us. I always notice. I don't know if you. I always notice who gets served. They came after us.
Yeah, I think I
They're,
watch that.
their little amuse-bouche thing. And
Yeah.
so then he comes and he gives us. It's a very nice white tablecloth rather French restaurant. And so then he takes our orders for hors d'oeuvres, and then they've got their hors d'oeuvres onto the entree. We haven't gotten hors d'oeuvres yet. Now I'm getting angry. It's my birthday, and you're niggering me on my birthday. I'm pissed.
Yeah.
And so I say something to him. The hors d'oeuvres are on the way, and he brings to me something with pork in it. Last time I had pork, I was 14 years old. I said that to him. He said, "You ordered it." I said, "I don't eat pork. I don't order what I don't eat."
Right.
And the fact that he wanted to argue with me. And so I got a little louder, and then the maitre d' came over and apologized profusely. And I said, this is my birthday dinner, and it's already been miserable. I'm really upset. And so we got decent, not really good, but decent service after that. That's San Francisco to me.
Yeah.
It's pushback where if you go somewhere and you have a meal out and you're comfortable, it's a relief. Not the restaurants you can go to. I'm always comfortable with restaurants in the Mission District. I'm always, you know what I mean? I'm always comfortable at the very few couple or three black restaurants. Go to Aunt Mary's on 3rd Street.
Well, you're talking about the new San Francisco, the San Francisco that's eating up the old San Francisco.
Yeah, but there is a wonderful black restaurant in San Francisco.
Yeah.
But it's not Mary's, it's Auntie. Anyway, that I love to eat at, makes the best fried fish in the world. That there are places, but it's not like you can go somewhere and know you're going to be treated just with respect.
Right.
And that's not, I do remember during my young years, like going to Woolworths and sitting at the counter with my friend, and we were like big girls because we could go to Woolworths by ourselves and order ourselves an ice cream sundae or some little treat that we had saved for. And the waitresses not being particularly pleased necessarily to serve us, but they did, But San Francisco it's a very difficult city. And I had a friend of mine talking about, you walk down the street and some people who I guess they think they're entitled to more space would just bump into your shoulder. Who does that? Who is so ill-mannered? And then when they forget to say, excuse me, and I'm good about reminding me, I'll say, you're excused.
It's interesting. When I experience that, it's horrible when you're speaking with restaurants. But the only time I really get infuriated is when I'm actually at a Mexican restaurant and I see white people getting preferential treatment at a Mexican restaurant by Mexicans, and that only ever happens in Orange County, in my experience, and that I've experienced it. And when that happens, I just become absolutely. There's one place in a city in Orange where I literally saw the wait staff, these people that are just like, I went there a couple of times and they would always my service always slow, and I literally saw them laughing and joking and even hugging these drunken white people. One of them kissed them on the cheek. It was horrible. It was a horrible moment of being like kind of accosted by the customer, and they were just like, that was they were in their element. So that's
there's
individual.
Don't know how to get over. They don't know how to go up the ladder, and they think it's by shaming themselves and their brethren and sisters. Yeah.
It's like they want me out of there. Like, what are you doing? We're trying to do something here, and what you're messing it up. So
yeah. But there's a level of stupidity because, after all, you made it authentic. That's the way Anglos think. It's not authentic if there's not sprinklings of the right people there.
Right. They don't want to be in a room where they're by themselves. They're like, wait a minute, this must not be good.
Exactly. Now they want to be in a room where whatever the ethnicity is, there's at least a few of them, not too many. Don't want to be uncomfortable.
They don't want to be uncomfortable. They want to be assured of quality. Yeah, that seems to be the case. So your poetry, the poetry that you've written over the years, you manage. It's great getting you great acclaim in the city in which you were born, but it's also allowed you to travel all over the world, all over the world. Could you speak to our audience about some of the most wonderful, some of the places you've traveled, performing your poetry?
Okay, not all over yet. I'm open. I want to travel more places,
Okay,
but I'll
well,
tell you some of the places I've been. I think one of the most gratifying places was Venezuela. And the year that I was invited there was sadly the year that, tell me his name, it just flew out my head, died. The
Hugo Chavez.
president of Venezuela. Huh? Not
Chavez.
the current one.
Hugo Chavez.
Chavez died. Right, thank you. Sometimes names have always been hard for me. Anyway, the whole country in this festival would become a place for poetry. So they had poets from India and from France and from China. It really was an international world festival, which is how I travel to international world festivals. And the first night we were at this lovely theater that they had, and they held the show because the vice president was going to be there. And I was like, God, it would be hard to get a mayor to an international poetry festival in the United States. And we've got the vice president there, and then they took us all, they divided all the poets up, and we went to different places, sometimes right on the edge of the city or in the city, community centers and like that. We had a translator that read our poems. In my case, if you spoke Spanish, you were good. I kind of speak almost none. I can read a little more I can understand a little more and read a little more than that, but I'm definitely am shamed by my lack of language. But they would read my poem and then I would read my poem. I had learned one in Spanish because I just thought that was just rude not to at least bring one poem in Spanish myself. And the places we went to went to a housing development. We had to fly across Venezuela, and it was one of the ones that Chavez had built for the poor. And they would come out and they would sing and they would recite their poetry so it was just this real sense of Venezuela holding poetry in its heart. And then after like a week of this, on the 7th or 8th day, we all came back to the center, and then they had another reading where we all were there, and the place was packed. I mean, it was incredible experience because it was not just the city we were in, which is most of my experience with international festivals. Whatever city it's in is the city it's in. But beyond that they really took us out to the countryside and took us out and then brought us back in. It was an incredible experience. So that was, yeah. Been to Italy several times. That's a beautiful experience. The Casa de Poesie, which people should look them up online. See if I can spell it. CASA. Is it? I have it here somewhere.
Is that Espanol?
CASADELLAPOESIA. Casa, CASA, Della, DELLA, Poesie, POESIA.org. Because on it, they film the poets that come in their original language, and then they have the original language poems up online, maybe with a performance, and then the Italian translations. And there are loads of Spanish language poets too, loads of English language poets, and then Chinese and Tuareg and Syrian and just the world again. And they're a small, really, literally mom and pop organization that has had years and years of poetry. Now they just bring in a poet or two and have them do, like I did, a mini tour of parts of southern Italy and went to Sardinia last year because they can no longer afford the huge festivals. But what was so nice of that is I always had a sense of being with the people. The other countries love poetry and honor poets, and it's so wonderful to have your work translated and have people come up to you and say they felt you, they heard you, you spoke to them. It's humbling and it's an honor. I just love it. And I've been to Jamaica, which is my grandmother's birthplace. So it was my first time in Jamaica on the beach. That was, I mean, I haven't been to a festival that's not wonderful. I was Casa de Poesy created it, but it was held in Sarajevo, and that
So
was to see a city that had been under sieged and bombed, because you go past like apartment buildings and they're like, if you take a shoebox and cut windows across, that was the kind of apartment building it was. And when you looked at it, you would see, as in most of Europe, clothes, and in other countries too, hanging out the window on, right? And you could tell a family, right? You'd go like, okay, grandmother, mother, husband, children. You can read the clothes, and it tells you a story of that household. Between one floor windows and clothesline and another floor window and clothesline, there's the in between, and it was riddled with gunfire. Just riddled. The holes were still there. So you could look at it and go, oh my God, all these windows were shot out a few years ago. How many people in these houses died? And then you look at the bottom of the building and you'd see where they had plastered back and reinforced the foundation. And in America, we don't have a sense of war except for the young men. If you live on the blocks and the young men war with each other, you hear the gunshots, you hear the sirens, you know the death tolls, you have a sense of that. And but if you're not in that very narrow thing, and that's a specific kind of war, you don't have a sense of war in America, because there hasn't, the Civil War was the last one and people have forgotten. But when going to Sarajevo, and then also there were still bombed out buildings and things, even though, it was a very visceral education to what war really is. And I've always been about peace and against war. But when it's right there, I actually put this one woman in a poem of mine. I was in Sarajevo twice, because I sat with her, and she was telling me her story, and she said, I have nobody now. I lived stories in the past, and she would tell me about this relative, this one, the other one. And then she would look at me and she would take my hand and she would say, they're all dead. I hope you don't mind. All I have are my stories. And it was like, it's another thing. So I think that the traveling for poetry also teaches me, and the people that are there that I am with teach me and show me, guide me into what I should be writing about. Maybe to make me keep questioning and looking at my imperatives.
yeah, so that really it begs the question. I mean, like, you are a poet of stature. You are known. You have ability to travel and speak. Kind of, like, for the purposes of people that invite you as a representative of the people of the U.S., for lack of a better term. What do you feel is your responsibility, when you're out there, to speak against these things that, these are American bombs dropping all over the world? So, like, well, how do you what is for those who are able to travel and, across different countries, what is our responsibility when we're there?
Well, my work speaks to that. And I feel like when I choose work to share, I may have a love poem I share. I may have a poem that's more personal I share. I definitely will have things about cosmology, because I'm really interested in our place in the universe. But I share that to let people know we see it too. The media and the leadership is not the people. And in fact, in Venezuela, I was at this community center and I did all my poems, and this elderly woman came up, which means older than me, since I guess I'm now there. But anyway, she gave me a big hug and she said, thank you, in Spanish. She said, at first, and she spoke in Spanish, luckily, simply. But she said, at first, I thought you were just a gringo, but now I know you are a human. Thank you. Thank you for your poetry. And to me, that was, yes, that's it.
Yeah.
That's who I am. Don't stamp me and you don't know me. And I think that that's important. It's important to be that. You can't just be like, oh, I'm on the good side. I think that one is on the correct side, the side of humanity. That's the correct side, through one's good works. And so your work, so as a poet, it's easy for me. I speak to that. And I think that whatever, one should always do something in their life that speaks to healing, that speaks to like your resistance. And then if you travel, when you're talking to people, you can ask, you can say, oh, you noticed, and be aware of their news, be aware
Mhm.
of what's going on with them.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
don't just know your corner of the world, so you can really discuss things. And then if it comes out, you can say, well, I'm trying to do this, I'm trying to do that, which encourages the idea that individuals make change collectively.
Yeah.
But you have to act, you know. You don't all have to do the same thing, but you have to act.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember actually when I was so blessed and fortunate to travel to Havana and do poetry. I was really struck by the I mean I was struck by what they've accomplished, but I was also struck by like how horrible these sanctions are and how I come whether whatever I profess in my heart, I hold that blue passport. I have a responsibility. I mean, like I'm
Mhm.
not saying it's my fault. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying I need to go back and I need to do something. I mean, because this is wrong.
Write letters, talk to. That's on my list of places I haven't been that I want to go with my poetry.
Well,
But but that's what I'm saying. You have to openly be an American and let people know there's the other America, and you speak from the other America. You know,
yeah.
and how did the Cubans? Well, you're bilingual, right? So
I mean, like un poquito, sí, sí, somos un poco pocho, so like it's broken,
yeah, but that's
I got the accent, so that don't get so mad, but but I was gonna say is as far as Cuba's concerned, though, after we're done with the interview, stick around for a second, and we'll talk. I know a guy who knows a guy, so maybe we can we can yeah. But so yeah, so um the trip to Italy that sounds familiar to something that a mutual friend of ours, Jack Hirschman, was involved. I mean, is that the same connection or is it
it's
different?
the same connection. And Jack just they were looking for somebody, and he recommended me, and so then they had me, and they had me back. And then I recommended Jenny Lim. You know, I'm always trying. I've recommended other poets they haven't taken on, and I know I can't think of any Latino poet I've ever seen them. Not because they haven't got a list of names, but it may be because they have so many Spanish poets and
Mm,
Brazilian poets, and you know what I mean. That they've got a lot of languages covered, and they're not thinking Latinx. They're not thinking United States. You know. Or I could be wrong because they do it everywhere. They did for years and years before me. But I don't know of any.
yeah,
But they're pretty broad. But it's the same connection. Yeah.
yeah. And Jack's one of those poets that writes in like three or four languages. I mean, he's just going back and forth.
Okay. He's a polyglot, you know, and he and his wife Aggie, they really have been all over because they've been to China and to I mean, and to Cuba, of course, and to just all kinds of places. You know, Vietnam,
Yeah.
you know, really, really traveling. And Jack, he writes poems every day. Were I that disciplined?
Well, that's a good transition. Let's get into your writing practices, and then how do you yeah give us a view into the world of the devorah major, sitting down to write some poetry.
Yeah, you know, it's really funny about, you know, if you think of athletes, they practice and then they have the real game, you know. But like writers and doctors always practice. You never get to the other side of it, you know. But I don't do any of the things that all of your monumental writers will tell you do. I don't have a schedule. I don't pick a time of the day. I just write, and I try to give myself or to make for myself enough headspace to write. Certainly, I've been writing, for example, a lot more poetry since being sheltered in place. But you know, you can write for hours and only come out with one poem. You know, if you're lucky. You know, if you're lucky, you got one good poem. Some days I get two good poems out of it. But I still don't write every day. I write and I read, and I, you know, with and I because I write fiction. I write novels and short stories, and I write poetry. I'm trying to push myself into writing more creative nonfiction and essays. So it's also what writing I need to do right then, unless I'm on assignment. I have a deadline for something, or a project I'm contracted, a writing project I'm trying. Then I'm very disciplined because I'm a sucker for deadlines. I give myself deadlines. That is the one thing I do. I want to have this novel finished by Blake. I'm writing poems. I'm writing poems. I think I have enough for a book. I'm going to have a new book manuscript put together by blah. Because other than that, it can never get done. It'll never get done.
Yeah.
You know, it'll sit there just simmering. You know, and so I'm more like that. I think that the real cohesion is between me reading and me writing an incredible amount in my head. Particularly because I've moved out of San Francisco, although I'm hoping to move much closer to the city this fall. Right now I'm in Antioch, which is like 50 miles away, so it's a hellish commute. But having so many hours to commute, I mean, it's in a weekday morning pre-COVID,
Yeah.
3-hour commute. Normally it's an hour. But so it's a lot of time, and I do a lot of pre-writing in my head. I think out plots. I think of a lot of times I'll just find that for me sometimes one line is the key to a poem. Well, I haven't lately, but I sometimes actually do have about that, pulling over off the freeway to snatch a poem, to write a poem down. And but I will now, what I will at least do is I will keep reciting the line that is the key that will get me in, or the two lines, and then I'll walk in the door and I'll try to immediately, or I'll in the car before I get out, write those two lines down, knowing even if I can't come back to it that evening, when I come back, I have the key. Because very often, particularly with poems, it's just that opening. And once I have the opening, I just go on in and start discovering stuff.
So you mentioned just now that you, in addition to being, in addition to being a prolific poet, you're also a novelist. Can you tell our audience a little bit about some of your novels?
Yeah, I have two published novels, one speculative fiction that I'm actually doing a rewrite on now because I shopped it and I was successful, but then the publishing small presses took a dive, and so he kind of pulled the contract, so now I have to resell it. But anyway, the first one that was published was called An Open Weave, and it takes place in a California city that I kind of made up, kind of somewhat based on pieces of Oakland, somewhat based on some Southern California, kind of open and flatter than San Francisco is what I'm saying. It was a lot, but still with some hills, but more rolling hills than really steep hills. And a Black family that is very special. They're not related by blood, but there's a grandmother who can see with her fingertips. She's blind, but she can see colors. So she weaves and makes these beautiful weavings because she can actually feel the resonance in colors. And then there's her adopted daughter who was born, who when she was born, her mother had a brain aneurysm and died literally at the same moment as one was born. The other died. And so this woman that could weave with her fingertips, she could feel colors with her fingertips. She just kept a little baby because that was her closest friend, and she just kept her. And this character, could travel in time but not space. So they go to a beach, for example, in South Carolina, where some boats, slave ships would come into. And she's sitting on the water, and the waves come and lap on her. And suddenly she sees Africans under the water following the sun, looking east to go back to Africa, because she's back in time to when they died and jumped off the ship or were thrown off the ship. And she sees their spirits or other things, but wherever it is, she'll be on a place. A lot of times I go to places in California, I try to imagine what it was like when they were just the first peoples were here, without the roads, without everything, And so she'll be somewhere, and she'll go back in time to then, and she'll just see maybe off to the side a village of the first people. And then she has her daughter, Imani, and that's biological daughter. And Imani can tell you just what's right at the front of your mind. So, you lose your keys, and you could say to her, oh, God, I lost my keys. Where did I put them? And she'll say, oh, they're on top of the refrigerator. Because it'll be right there, but you just haven't pulled it up yet. And so the story it revolves around them and this young girl who ended up in foster care as a teenager and is pregnant and has nobody loves her. She lives in foster care except her two friends. And so she's out with Imani and another girl, and they're basically kind of just running the streets while she figures out what to do with this unwanted pregnancy. And that's the thing. And, and finally Imani says, come to my house. And the elders, it's Imani's birthday. She doesn't come over for her birthday. So they're looking for her. And within it, there's all these stories that come out about each of the characters.
There's so much there. There's so much richness there. But I'm always curious about these like weird little things. What did you name this fictional city?
Well, I didn't want to. I think I called it Buttonhole or something. I didn't want to have. I don't remember, but I didn't want to have people. I did in my next book. Brown Glass Windows takes place in San Francisco and a little bit in Oakland, and I placed everything and I placed everyone. But I didn't want to do that in my first book because I was just so invested in the people. So I wanted a little playground that wasn't really developed like San Francisco's big playgrounds are. Really simple playground. I wanted where people lived relatively close to each other, but they weren't crowded, So I hadn't lived in a city like that, but I traveled a lot. I've traveled a lot in the United States too. My father, every time there was a 3-day weekend, we were in the car on Friday and we got back in the middle of the morning, Monday morning, to get a few hours of sleep before work and school. And so I went through a lot of we were always going to somewhere like Big Sur or Crater Lake or something. But I learned a lot about little towns and small towns during that time. So I'd seen them and driven through them. And plus we'd crossed the country in a car, camping and seeing the country several times. So I just felt more comfortable. This was the kind of community I wanted, but I had never lived in one. So the best thing to do was to make it up. So that way readers could go with whatever errors I made.
Yeah, that's wise. I'm interested though. So how is it different to write in this fictional city? I mean, like, how does it affect the development of the characters to write in a city that doesn't actually exist, that you can just make up as you go along, versus a city that very much exists? If you get it wrong, people will think that you just don't know the city, and they'll get mad and be like, "No, Cafe Trees is on this street, not that street. What are you doing?" That sort of thing. How does it affect the character development?
Well, the way the characters in An Open Weave grew out of this one house with like 3 rooms. They didn't really grow out of the city. I just needed to introduce components of the city because I had the girls traveling through it and I had backstories to tell. San Francisco actually grew out of a time when the Fillmore was torn down, and they left it that way for 20 years because they didn't really want us to come back in. And when you came back, I one day I was just thinking, I wonder what this looked like to Vietnam vets when they came back. I bet they thought it was just a bombed out place. And so I actually created a few short stories that I ended up turning into a novel around that idea, so that the characters very much came out of San Francisco. So like there's the one woman that is central that oh, and I have poems uh, in between the stories, and she's all dressed in white, and she I haven't seen her in years. I don't know if she's still alive. She painted herself white. She wore white gloves, white dress, white stockings, white shoes, white hat. Okay. And I would see her in the Tenderloin sometimes. And one time I saw her, and I had written, and I had talked to a few friends. Have you seen the Lady in White? Have you? And most people said no, but every once in a while somebody would say one. This one friend of mine, a good poet, Aya de Leon, writer, she said to me, "Well, have you seen the Man in Red?" And I said, "My Lady in White is real." She said, "My Man in Red is real." I said, "Okay, fair exchange." I was at Esperanza eating lunch not a month later, and there he was, all in red, painted red, sweeping the sidewalk. And I was like, "Thank you." You were my call. But anyway, he's not in the book. But the Lady in White is. And one time I had my post office box was in the Tenderloin, and I was sitting. I had sent my son in to pick up my mail, and I was sitting in the driver's seat with the window half down, and this lady walked by, and she was talking to someone I couldn't see. And I went, "Oh." So in the book, a ghost narrates it, and that's who the white woman in white was talking to, was the ghost, and she narrates the story, which actually begins. Not the story doesn't begin. The story it begins with San Francisco and post-Vietnam War and a Vietnam vet and his son and like that. But within the story is her coming to San Francisco, and she came with Cortez because on Cortez named California Califia, which is a black Amazon queen, and he had, they say, a third of his crew was of African descent, and so she rode over as ghost, following the man she was supposed to marry, that she was madly in love with, but she died first. And he walks off the boat and tells her to leave him alone. To leave him alone. He's tired of running away from her. And she just decides, well, I'll just stay here. Where am I? And it becomes San Francisco. And so that story is very rooted in San Francisco. And I grew up in San Francisco. So now I know the streets. I know where the mini park, I navigated people. If you didn't know, this is where it was. And everybody was like, yep, yeah, that was clearly a San Francisco story. And so the characters grew out of place, whereas in the other ones, the characters grew out of this household.
Yeah. Uh, you mentioned in all this the writer Ada de Leon, and I actually met her not too long ago at an event along with Roberto Lovato for the Dignidad Literaria, an event where they're protesting the American dirt and pushing back against Macmillan. And there's just such a strong community of very righteous kind of writers in the Bay Area. They kind of seem to all kind of coagulate. Like you mentioned Jack earlier, you of course, Roberto, Ida. So like, what accounts for this? What accounts for
I don't know. I think it's the part of what I said. A lot of us came up in a time where we believed in change and fomented change through our work, and came together then. And so then our offspring and their offspring, that's the natural way of doing it. So like one of the wonderful poets that I've worked with is Leticia, who's another generation from me, a generation down. Hernandez, sorry. Uh, Linares. Hernandez Linares. That's her whole name. Leticia Hernandez Linares. An incredible poet and performer, but a generation down, because that's part of what you do. But she too is interconnected. And I know, that there is that kind of idea that we made this matrix during the struggles of the 60s and 70s, but it wasn't something that was to disintegrate with us. Rather, it was an arts practice that was to continue. And yes, Bob Kaufman was in the Beats, but as far as I know, that was it. I mean, there was Ted Jones, but they, and Baraka, but they weren't San Francisco poets per se. There were very little women they acknowledged. So that idea of this very multicultural community, where I remember being on a stage with Juan Felipe and Jenny and I can't remember his name, and I think he's passed on now. He did pass on, I know for sure. He passed with AIDS. But a Latino poet who was also and one of the I remember. But anyway, we were all at the intersection, and we were all just talking about where we'd been and where we were trying to go, what we were trying to do. But we had all known each other for quite, maybe Avacha was there. We'd all known each other for quite a while, and that's just how we rolled. And so I think I think that's because that's how the Bay Area rolled at the time. And not to say there weren't Black communities and Latino communities and Japanese, and not that everybody didn't have their communities too. But I don't know how it was. I don't know. I don't know so much in terms of Latinx communities. I know that it was not unusual to be in the Black community at a party or a social event and have people of other ethnicities there. I know that I had in Haida a Filipino friend who lived around the corner, and I would be invited to all her family's events, and I was just a part of it. My father had some Nicaraguan friends, and the family would go. You know, there was that I was brought up in that way, and so the communities we were in, sometimes we were the other, sometimes there were some others with us. Sometimes we, but that idea of this mixing, I grew up with that.
Yeah.
I grew up with that, and so I guess it's odd for other people, but like LA is so spread out. You're going to be where you are.
Yeah.
In San Francisco, it's a little city. We all use the same downtown.
Yeah. Wow. This has been an incredible hour. Again, the Dawes Center for the Arts. We're so deeply fortunate and honored to be joined by Devorah Major, the third poet laureate of San Francisco. Devorah, are there anything projects coming up that people should be on the lookout for that you have coming up that
Oh yeah, I'm really excited. About I have a book that's gonna drop July 31st. It was gonna be in April, but COVID pushed it on back. And it's called Califia's Daughter, and that's because I was born in California, and at some state in my adulthood, I was in New York. At the time, I had a long distance relationship with a New Yorker. And I'm walking down New York, and I said, you know what? I am so California. I am just not New York. I enjoy New York, but after a few days, I'm worn off. I don't want to be on like that. I don't want to have all my antenna out like that. I'm done. But I am so Californian, also because I spent so much time in the woods and the outdoors, and was at Yosemite and Esalen went before it opened. My father had us there, and we were in Berg Sur and down in Santa Barbara on the beach, sleeping on the beach, and all like that. That I wanted to do a book that reflected that, and also reflected my Caribbean heritage, because I realized also that I always thought I was so different, just because my mother was white, so I'm a breed. And then I was at a funeral of my aunt, and everybody there had West Indian heritage, first or second generation. And we were talking about all the things we had in common, and I was like, oh my God, I'm Caribbean. And Opal Palmer Adisa, who I worked with for years, talked about the fact. So Califia's Daughter is more personal than any of the other books. It's still got some political edge, but I really am looking at that this Afro-Caribbean born in California and what that means, and trying to, and those ideas with some pictures of the Caribbean and some of California. And like I said, I'm always into nature and the stars and what is my place as human. We're so minuscule. We're so little itty bitty. When you look up at the sky, we're not even that big. Subatomic particle in the universe, Yeah, but that's the biggest thing I'm working on. I'm also, like I said, I'm rewriting my novel, which I'm renaming, and I don't have a new name yet, so I can't even say. It was Ice Journeys, but it's not going to be that. Looking for a name, but that's it. But yeah, I am going to be updating in the next month. Finally, my website, which is devorahmajor.com, and I put up interviews. Maybe you'll interview for me.
Yeah.
They're written in questions. You send them back, and then I send links to anywhere you want. performances of everything. You can go look at my site, but you can go there and see old interviews that I've done with people, and I put up articles sometimes. And I interviewed my father for several years before he died, and I've edited down the tapes, and I put up some sections of the tapes and stuff.
Wow, that must be experience.
Always working, lots of projects, lots of projects.
Yeah, that's always working. So that's a beautiful thing. Thank you so much for having joined us. I won't take up any more of your time, but thank you again. And this is really, I was really honored and shocked. That
I'm Mr. Sadila.
we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.